Following the Moravians, what happened was a huge kind of uptick in missionary activity, which we call the first wave of modern missions. The first wave of modern missions. And this wave was missionaries taking the good news of Christ to the seaports and the coastlands of the world. And this is especially between the 1730s and the 1850s. There were now many believers in Europe, and in some ways a degree of Christian civilization. A vision now had been born for going into all the world. But in the 18th century, this was also the era of exploration. For a couple hundred years, the Spanish ships and others have been going around the world, discovering the globe and opening commerce and all that. So we're talking about technology and various things. One of the main things that was there were boats. So what happened was, Germany for hundreds of years really was the center of what God was doing for a period of time. But it began to switch to England, the British Isles, for a period of time. And during the first wave of modern missions, what essentially happened was the missionaries realized there are boats going everywhere for the first time in history. We need to get on those boats, and we need to go with them to the coastal cities of the world. And so they got on the boats and began to travel around Cape Horn. That's how, of course, they were going into Asia. They came across to the New World. They came into the seaport areas. Notice some of the dots that are along the coastal areas here. Especially during that time period, most people lived near the seaports. They lived near the coastlands. Just like today we live near malls or towns or whatever. That's where the center of trade was. It's where water was. It's where civilization was. So this again was a kind of a natural advance. But to start this all off in terms of a major figure in history, we want to begin with the man who's considered the father of modern missions. Now that's after the Moravians and maybe Zinzendorf, but he's called the father of modern missions. And that man's name is William Carey. William Carey. And he was an Englishman. He was a Brit. And God used him tremendously to launch, in an official way, the age of modern missions. William Carey was born in 1761. He was a common guy, just like any of us. He was apprenticed to be a shoemaker, cobbler in England. But what he did in 1792 revolutionized the world. He actually published a book which was really the first missiologist book of all time. 87 pages. I'll give you the exact title. It was called An Inquiry into the Obligation of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathens, in which the religious state of the different nations of the world, the success of former undertakings, and the practicality of further undertakings are considered. 40 words. They liked long titles during those days. But it's been narrowed down to an inquiry into the obligation to reach the heathen. You can actually pull this right up on the web. It's phenomenal to look at. 87 pages, where Carey gives just a brief history of missions. Then he has about 40 pages of charts of the world where who knows how he got the data, So he didn't get it like we got it today, but he names about the 100 countries in the world at the time. He estimates, what they believe and how many are saved and lost and the gospel and so forth. It's just an amazing thing if you look up his original book. So he's the first one to kind of say, hey, we need to look at the world and we are obligated to go forth and to reach them. And that gave birth to the first Protestant missionary society that was called the London Baptist Missionary Society, of which Carey became famous for this phrase: expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. Expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. Carey married, sailed to India in 1793. India. So he got on a boat in the British Isles, traveled in a boat without a motor all the way up here to what's now is modern day Calcutta. Took him 5 months to get there. During those days, a lot of people died on the way. That's not your normal mission trip compared to today. He and his family eventually moved a little bit north of Calcutta and were engaged in ministry there. By 1795, they'd started the first Baptist church in India. Remember, we said Thomas had actually gone to India centuries before, but now we're many years later. And the first Baptist church in 1795, north of Calcutta in India, there were 4 members. Unfortunately, they were all Brits. So not much happened there in the first couple of years, though they tried. Carey eventually moved south. His first wife died. He married another woman. She died, married another. A lot of the missionary stories are filled with incredible heartache, incredible loss, incredible disease, all kinds of things, and incredible human foibles. These people are no different than you and I. And you see that when you read all their biographies. But nonetheless, tremendous dedication. Eventually, Carey set up in a place called Serampore, which is much closer to Calcutta. And he gave about 34 years of his life toward reaching the Indian population for Christ. He was joined there by a couple guys. They became kind of a famous missionary team. Their names were Joshua Marshman and William Ward. And they began to do a number of different things over these 3 decades. One of the biggest was Bible translation. And by 1824, they had actually translated the Bible into 6 different Indian languages. Now, of course, in India at this time, you didn't just have Hindi, the main language, you had all kinds of other languages, just like in many other countries. So they did 6 different translations of the full Bible and 46 partial translations in other languages. Carey spent his entire life translating, getting schools started, including a college, Serampore College, which endures to today, church planting, and getting involved in many of the issues of his day, which included things like euthanasia, which was tremendously, horrifically popular in India. And another thing you probably maybe not heard much about, but it's called widow burning. It's the idea that in Indian culture, when a man died, the woman was burned on the pyre with him, alive. The woman was killed as a result of the man dying, called widow burning. And many of these things, again, savage, horrific, Carey, gently in a Christ-like way began to fight against for many aspects of social change. But he realized the Bible was key, education was key, medicine was key, planting churches was key. But really today, the Indian church, which is becoming one of the biggest in the world. In fact, some people believe the Indian church today is somewhere between 10 to 25% of the population. It's very hard to count. That's incredible in the world's second biggest nation, about to become the world's largest nation. William Carey laid the foundation for that. And again, primarily we're talking about coastal areas to begin with. Calcutta's the coast there. I want to mention another kind of a pioneer missionary during this first wave of modern missions, again, to the seaports, to the coastlands. This was an American. His name is Adoniram Judson. Adoniram Judson. And he and his wife, Anne, were actually the very first American missionaries in Asia. Judson arrived in Burma. Some of you may know that Burma is not called Burma today. It's called Myanmar. He arrived in Burma with his wife, Anne, in 1813. They then studied the Burmese language 12 hours a day for 3 to 4 years. 12 hours a day. It was a very difficult language compared to American English. After 12 years, they'd seen 18 Burmese give their lives to Christ after 12 years. They spent, in total, his wife died young, as others did, but others spent a total of 37 years in Burma, which is now Myanmar today, only leaving one time in 37 years, one furlough, to America. They left behind a Bible translation and tremendous inroads into the Karen community, which is a huge, explosive one today where God's doing many wonderful things. They left 100 churches and 8,000 believers as a result of them sowing the seeds. And we've gone, of course, we're talking now about India being where William Carey was, primarily a Hindu nation. And then we go to Burma down here in Southeast Asia. We're talking about a Buddhist nation. So again, a major inroads into an area of spiritual darkness. The third missionary that I want to mention in this category of just these early pioneers, again, the idea is that during this time period, beginning in 1793 and up until the early part of the 19th century, missionaries began getting on boats and coming to coastal areas around the world, of which Carey was the first one, but others went as well. The final one I want to mention is Robert Morrison. Robert Morrison, who is from Scotland. He was a Scot. He landed in China in 1807, so this is just a few years after Carey. And he worked in China for 27 different years, primarily in two different places. He traveled and came into China and arrived near what we call Hong Kong today, a Portuguese colony. It's known as Macau. And then he especially ministered in Macau and in another city that for many years was called Canton. I was there about a year ago. Today it's called Guangzhou, one of the biggest cities in China. And that's where Robert Morrison basically lived his life. He gave the Chinese their first Bible, their very first Bible in Chinese. An incredible feat. And one of the main things that began to advance the gospel in China. He also completed a dictionary. It was especially used by foreigners to be able to deal with the Chinese language. Started a school like they all did. Dispensary for medical needs in these areas of China. I was reading an article recently which just came out in Christianity Today about how the missionaries of this era created the modern world. And that's really true. We can't imagine the darkness, the primitiveness, the poverty, the superstition that were in many nations of the world during this time period. And when the missionaries came, especially to the coastal areas, first of all, they fought all of those things. It wasn't just a matter of handing out tracts. It was a matter of people dying from diseases and being educated to be able to read and learning how to start businesses and casting off all the devils and demons and many different things. It was incredible all they did. And basically, the missionaries of this time period and after that, they laid the foundation for all that these nations possess today. They made the modern world. It was incredible. And so this first wave of modern missions was an initial thrust after the Moravians to get on the boats, get on the ships, traveling around the world, and go to the seaports, the coastal areas, where they began to leaven those nations with the gospel.